In this scene, we'll have a look at the xpWave and xpFoam dynamic modifiers. We'll set up some rolling surf using xpWave. And then we'll create some foam and spray particles using xpFoam. In this scene, we've set up a very simple beach setup. So we have a piece of beach geometry, beach mesh, which we can see here. And this has an xParticles collider tag on it. And then what we've got is a cube. We've called it volume container. And we're just viewing this using a display tag in wireframe mode. But if we just switch that tag off, you'll see it's just a parametric cube. Let's put our wireframe back on. Then we have a collider tag on that as well, and that collision tag is set to have the normals on the inside. So basically our cube is our container that's going to hold our water particles, and then we've got this collision object, this beach mesh, which is going to make them react as well. Now obviously, as far as modifiers goes, we've got a gravity modifier in here. We have an xParticles emitter, which is this blue box emitter. And we have an xpFluid effects fluid solver in there. And this is just set to the defaults on fast accuracy. So if we hit play, you'll see that our particles are being affected by the gravity, but obviously the fluid solver is doing its thing, and they're behaving in this fluid-like way. So just before we move on to xpWave, let's just have a look at our xpKill modifier that we've got set up here. So we've got this set up for a couple of reasons. First of all, let's just switch the xpKill off. What we have is our emitter, and you can see certain parts of it are actually intersecting our ocean geometry. If we just make that ocean geometry invisible, the beach mesh, and switch that off. So if we hit play to simulate without our xpKill modifier on, you'll see the particles that are born intersecting that kind of fall through, and now they're just sloshing around at the bottom of our container. That's obviously not what we want. This is needlessly taking up computational power. We only want the particles that are on this surface. So what we have done is set up a kill modifier. Let's have a look at it. And we've got the xpKill modifier set to object mode. And look, we've dragged in the beach mesh, and we've said if the particles are inside the mesh, then kill them. And so with that active, if we hit play, they just get deleted straight away. And now we're only processing the particles we need to, which are on the surface of our beach. Okay. So now that's all set up, now we can start having a look at xpWave, which is our dynamic modifier tool, which can help create rolling, lapping waves for your scene. So what we'll do, let's go to our Dynamics menu, and we'll go to the Dynamics object list, and we have got xpWave. So let's bring one into our system. And we get this object. So you can see the green bounds, and you can also see, look, we've got this deformed blue and white plane. And if we hit play, you can see, look, that plane is animating both in color and its deformation. And if we just make it invisible for a second, you can see, look, it's affecting our water. The waves are going in that same direction. So we're creating some waves. They're just going the wrong way at the moment. So let's reactivate our wave. You can see, look, there's a green arrow here, which is showing you the direction at which those waves are going. And that's always in the +Z. So what we need to do is rotate this. Let's hit R for the rotate option, and we'll just rotate it, hold shift, and we'll rotate it by -90 degrees. And then look, what we want to do is make sure that our bounds fit the bounds of our container. So let's move this one out, and let's move that one out, and we can just move it up a little bit as well. As long as we're in the bounds, that's going to work. All right. So now if we hit play, you'll see that those waves are now being forced in the right direction. And what's happening is we're creating this kind of upward movement velocity field using this animated noise. And this plane is just giving us a visual of what that noise is going to do to our particle surface. So you can see obviously the lighter parts of the noise are stronger, which are pushing the waves up into a crest, and the bluer parts have less power. So what we can do before we start making adjustments to the shape of this wave, we can actually adjust the visualization of this wave and this force. So if we just go to our xpWave object, we can go to the display tab. Now by default, we have the draw type set to surface, which is this animated deformed plane. But we can go to lines, and the lines are showing you the strength and obviously the upward direction of that force on our particles. And if we hit play, you'll see those lines animating. We can go to arrows, which is more processor intensive, but look, you can see the arrows there pointing upwards in the direction of that force. We can have surface, which is the default. We can also have a grid, which is quite a handy one because it means that you can see through that grid to the wave, and that gives us that animation. And if we want, we can increase the slices of this so you've got multiple grids so you can see what's going on. So all of that is just purely a visualization tool to help you see what this wave modifier is going to do to our particles. Let's just put that back down to 1, and we'll just leave it on grid for now. That looks okay. So let's have a look at the settings. Let's go to our Object tab of our xpWave, and we've got a number of different settings. Before we have a look at the settings near the top, let's just have a look at the settings that start at time scale. Because what you can see is that this is just an animated noise which is driving this force on our particles. And we can make adjustments to that noise like you can with any of the noises inside of Cinema 4D. So just so we can visualize this more easily, let's just go to the display mode. Let's set it to plane, which will be a flat surface, but will show the animated noise using the blue to white gradient. So here we can see the animated noise. So let's go to the Object tab. So we can make adjustments to this noise should we wish. Look, so we can do a low and a high clip, which will change it. So you can see that is altering the way in which that noise looks on our plane. We can increase the brightness, reduce the brightness, and of course we can increase and reduce the contrast as well. So those are noise controls that you will be familiar with. We can also use different types of noise. So by default it's set to noise, but we've got all of the Cinema 4D noises you can use should you wish. And then we have a couple of settings which are quite important. So we can obviously scale this noise. And the way in which it's scaled by default is 50 on the X and 5 on the Z. And what that has given us is this stretched out noise, which gives us this rolling wave force. So if we just reset this scale to say, I don't know, 5 and 5, then you can see that it looks much more like a traditional noise type. But obviously that's not going to work for waves because we're just going to get kind of blobs. Well, it may work for the look that you want. That's going to cause much more kind of rippling waves. We haven't got these kind of constant crashing long strips of wave. But that's with kind of equal scaling on the X and the Z axes. So by default, this is set to 50 to stretch that out, which then gives you the much more kind of rolling wave shape. You could go, depending on your scene, obviously, but you could change this. You could have this down to, say, 25, which will give you the same kind of stretched out wave, but we are going to have some differences near the end, especially as it animates. And so that's going to give a little bit more irregularity to that noise. Let's put that back up to, say, the default of 50. Then we've got a time scale. This is basically just how quickly it animates. So if we increase that, you're going to see it moving along a lot more quickly there. And so obviously that has the same impact on our water. Let's put that time scale back to 100. So that's just the animation of that noise and how quickly it animates. All right, so that's all pretty self-explanatory. If you're used to working with noises in Cinema 4D, there isn't much new there. So then we've got another couple of sliders. We have a strength. Now you have to be careful with strength, because if you crank this up too hard, your particles are going to be forced up really high and it's going to look really unrealistic very quickly. So let's just do that. Let's put it up to, say, 23 centimeters. And now look, they're just getting forced up so strongly that obviously the illusion of this being rolling waves has been lost, because where those waves are at their most powerful, there's just too much strength in the modifier. So let's bring that way down into something that's a little bit more manageable. But then we also have a fall-off graph. So this spline is really useful, because what we want to do, let's just change our display whilst we look at this to the surface mode, which shows us our deformation. Now what we really want, if we make our beach visible again, is we don't want as much wave power as the particles come up the beach. We only want it at this point to create the waves. So that's what we can use our spline for. Let's go to the Object tab. So what we want to do, if I reduce this strength spline here, if you watch our deformation in this area, you will see that it's no longer affecting this end of the sim. And that's probably a bit too severe. So let's bring this one over. And what this is saying is full power, full power, full power, full power till we get to about here, and then start tailing off that strength. Something like that. So that's going to give us this nice bigger waves where there is a bigger volume of water. And then as they start lapping up on the shore, the force of that modifier will reduce and reduce. So let's go back to our display, switch it off for now so we can see things a little bit more clearly. And we could actually, look, let's make our wave invisible to get rid of some of these boxes. It would be nice now, we don't need to see this emitter box. So let's go to the emitter water. Let's go to the display tab, and we can uncheck draw emitter, which will get rid of that bounding box. So now let's have a look at our waves. And let's see how we're doing. So obviously we've got our XP fluid effects in the default fast accuracy settings here, which means we're getting really nice playback in our viewport, but it also means it's not the most accurate of simulations. And one sign of that is you can see we've got these kind of flashing particles on the seabed of our simulation, and that's just because the fluid effects velocity solve isn't accurate enough, and we've got some kind of fast moving per frame particles here. So the way we would fix that to have a more accurate velocity solve would be in the fluid effect settings, and we would increase our accuracy presets. We're on the fastest one so far, but we could go up to medium, high, or accurate. But we'll just leave it on these settings for now. So let's just hit play and see what we've got. And it's always wise to play through quite a few frames here, because the nature of the animated noise, you may have 100 or 200 frames where it's all working perfectly, and then suddenly you may have a few frames where the animated noise gets to a point where it pumps too much force into your simulation, and all of a sudden you get a huge wave that doesn't actually look realistic. So play through it, get a good idea and a good feel for the sim. Now I'm just thinking we could perhaps have a little bit more strength. So let's just increase that strength up to, say, I don't know, we're just going to edge it up, maybe 13.5. Let's just play that through. So what we're getting is we're getting these nice kind of rolling, lapping waves coming up onto our rocks. I think we could maybe pull this fall off line a little bit further towards the shore to keep this kind of forwards momentum going. And that's looking pretty good. This wave is perhaps too strong, isn't it? Now, this is a perfect example of what I was suggesting, is that the noise can look fine for a certain amount of time, but then it gets to a point within its animation cycle where actually it's just too hot. It's giving too much force to to this area. So we could do a couple of things. We could reduce the high clip a bit to clip that power, but then you're going to risk flattening the wave. So let's just reduce this back down to, say, 12, and that should mitigate that. All right. So that's looking pretty good. And of course, you can make as many adjustments to that should you wish. And it's pretty intuitive and quite self-explanatory. And xpWave is perfect for making these very fast to set up rolling wave simulations. If you specifically want very regular rolling, crashing waves, a bit like you'd see on a surf beach with breaking waves happening very regularly, you would be better researching creating an actual wave pool, and there's loads of resources online for this if you look at it. But it would mean shaping the seabed appropriately and creating little kind of ridges which help create those breaking waves. And also you would use kind of an animated collision object that would regularly pulse to start creating those waves. So as I say, that's something that you can research, and there's lots of information online that you can look up to create those wave pools. But for creating very fast to set up rolling waves, xpWave will work very well for you. So let's start setting up some foam, because in water and fluid simulations you will find that it is the spray and the foam particles which can bring an incredible amount of detail to your sim, even if the base fluid sim is quite low resolution. So let's do that. What we will need to do in our scene is bring in a new dynamic modifier. So let's go to our dynamics menu and we'll go to the folder list, and we need to bring in an xpFoam. So let's bring that in. We'll just make a little bit more room here. Now, xpFoam is going to create new particles based on the underlying fluid simulation. So if we have a look in our xpFoam object, you can see it needs its own emitter because it's going to be creating new particles. So what we can do, you can drag in an emitter into this window, but it's easier just to hit create. So if we click on that, it automatically brings in a new emitter into our scene. So let's just rename that and call that emitter foam. And if we have a look at that emitter, if we go to the emission tab, you can see that the emission type is set to controlled only, which means we don't have the ability to adjust the start and the end emit and the birth rate and so on. And that's because it's being controlled by the xpFoam object. And we can visually see that. Look, it's turned red. When our emitters go red like this, it means they're in controlled only mode. So let's just, we don't want to see this red rectangle. So let's go to our display menu and we can just switch off draw emitter. And you can see also by default it's been set to have particle dots and for those to be white because they'll look like foam and spray. So what I'd like to do when we're first looking at this, so these particles are really obvious, instead of making them white, look, let's just make them a really garish green colour when they're created, so they'll be really obvious in our simulation. And we're also going to, let's just hit play for a couple of frames. You can see that our fluid sim is being coloured with this blue to white gradient. And let's just make a couple of adjustments to that so viewing our foam particles will be a bit more easy. So let's go to our XP emitter water. We'll go to the display tab and you can see, like always with fluids, we have got our colour mode for these particles set to gradient parameter. The parameter we're mapping the gradient to is the particle speed, and we've set the minimum speed to 0 and the maximum to 100. So what it's saying is particles that are not moving will be the dark blue colour, and particles that are moving 100 centimetres per second and faster will be the white colour, and everything else in between will be from this gradient. So what we want to do is just to make our foam particles a bit more obvious. Look, let's just get rid of the white, redistribute those knots, and maybe, look, put this max speed up to, say, 150. Now if we hit play, you'll see the white goes and it's slightly more of a subtle coloration. So that's our fluid. And now when our foam particles are produced, they're going to be bright green. So we're going to be able to see them nicely in our viewport. So let's have a look at our settings. Let's go to our xpFoam. So first of all, we're going to look at the emission settings. So this is how the foam particles are emitted, how they are created. And there are two different ways in which foam particles are created. They're created by the crests of the waves in our simulation, and they're also created by the air trapped in the water. So that's what we have, crest foam particles, and we have air foam particles. So what we're going to do is we're going to concentrate on just looking at our crest particles first. So let's switch off air. So to switch off the air particles, we just turn the air rate down to 0 and it can't create any air particles. So now it's only able to create these particles on the crests of the waves created in our fluid sim. So just before we alter the crest settings, let's just have a look at a couple of these settings below. We have an after age number, which is a frame number and a variation, and we have a life frame amount and a variation. So what this is saying is a fluid particle can only create a foam or spray particle if it is older than 60 frames old. Now, you may want this. For example, at the beginning of our sim, we've got this first few frames where the water's settling. We might not want to create foam particles there. So look, we can say, look, let's not create any until after frame, say, 35. So that's going to be perfect. And then we can have a bit of variation. Now, the variation for in this scene, all the particles are born at the same time, all our fluid particles. So the variation, it doesn't really matter, but it would create a kind of a fade in of these foam particles, so they didn't all just suddenly appear at once. But this is more useful if you are continually pumping more fluid particles into a scene, like a pouring scene, for example. And it just means that the foam particles wouldn't all be created at exactly the same time. So we can make it look a little bit more random. And then we have a life. This is the maximum life that these particles can live for. So we've got it set to 150 frames. So we'll just leave it at that. In fact, to ease computational power, so we haven't got as many particles in the scene, we could reduce that down so they only have a max life of 100, and then let's give that a bit of a variation, which again will give it a nice bit of randomness so they don't all disappear at the same time. And that'll do for now. So we'll just leave that as it is, and we'll start looking at our crest particles. So if we hit play, we would hope to see, after 35 frames, some green particles forming on the crests of this water. But it doesn't look like we're really getting anything, does it? So I've noticed a couple. Let's just switch off the visibility of the water, and let's go to our foam particles, and let's just change them to squares. So it's going to be totally obvious when these have been created. So we're playing the sim. It's now after frame 35. Oh, look, we've got 1, 2. So we've created 2 foam particles. That's a little underwhelming. So why have we only got 2? Well, the way in which it calculates how to create these crest particles, there's lots of clever maths going on under the hood, but what it's doing is we have the ability to adjust the potential for a fluid particle to create foam particles. And we adjust that potential using the minimum and maximum crest sliders. These are thresholds, so we can increase or decrease the potential of a particle to make a foam particle here, and we have that both for crest and for the speed of the particles. We can ignore impact for now, because impact is what we use to adjust the potential for air particles, but we're not looking at those at the moment. So we can adjust the speed and the potential of the crest. So let's look at speed first. What this is saying is any fluid particle moving below 90 centimeters per second has absolutely 0 potential for creating a crest particle. And then any particle moving 170 centimeters per second or more will have the full speed potential to create that foam particle. And between these amounts, that potential ramps up from 0 potential up into the maximum potential of 170. So if we reduce this maximum level down a bit to, say, 100, it's going to ramp up to having full potential based on the speed much more quickly. So we should get more particles. So just by doing that, we may see some more particles in this sim after frame 35. Let's have a look. Yes, so look, we've got loads more. All right. So that's already working. Let's have a look at that in context with our emitter water particles. We'll play it from the beginning. And we can see that we're going to start getting some particles moving here as we've got this more water moving. All right. So what you want is you don't really want the very slow moving particles creating these foam particles because that's not realistic. The very slow moving water isn't going to be trapping air and creating this foam and spray. I mean, we can artificially do that. Look, we can go way down to 10 as our minimum speed, and let's ramp up that potential to full really quickly by putting this on, say, 20. So then we're going to have loads of particles now because we have massively increased the potential of particles to be created because it's ramped up to full potential by the time we have particles at 20 centimeters. So look how many more particles we've got. But these ones aren't really realistic. We've just got lots of foam hanging around in this bit of water that's not really moving. So that's why we wouldn't want to create lots of particles at fluid that isn't moving very fast. So let's put this back up to something more realistic. So we'll put the min speed up to 70, and then we'll ramp up that relatively quickly up to the max to, say, when they're at 90, which is going to give us a good amount. All right. So now we've got the speed sorted. What other adjustments can we make? Well, now we can change the min and max thresholds for the potential of creating particles on the crests. Now, the crest is to do with the crest angle. So if you imagine a really steep braking wave is going to have a much greater crest angle to one like this, which has a very mellow crest angle. And realistically, you want the foam particles happening. The defaults are pretty good here, between 30 and 50% of that crest angle. So as the wave is starting to crash over, you want that crest particle created. But we're not getting very many with these settings. And the reason that is happening is because we just don't have enough detail in this simulation to accurately work out the crest angles within these swells. And the reason is we're working at a very low particle count. The particles are quite big, and we also have our fluid effects accuracy set to fast to simulate quite quickly. And so the fluid simulation isn't particularly accurate. Therefore, the foam calculation can't be particularly accurate. That doesn't mean we can't make adjustments to foam in low accuracy, fast simulating scenes. We just don't have as much artistic control. So, if we have a low-res scene like this and we want more crest particles, the way to do it is we can reduce the min crest value. So let's put this down to, say, something very low, 5%. And let's put our max down pretty low as well. So we're ramping up the full potential of creating crest particles by the time we get to 15% of that crest angle. So this is going to create loads more cresting particles. We're starting to get more here, look. We're still not getting any on this rolling section, but we're starting to get more in the simulation. So that's working for us. Now, before we move on, let's just have a look at our sim. Because what you can see is we are getting lots of foam particles being created on this side and almost getting trapped on the inside of our container. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a an additional kill modifier. So foam particles can't be created on this edge and on this edge. So what we will do is this. Let's go to our modifiers. Let's go to our control modifiers and bring in another kill modifier. And this kill modifier will keep it as this bounds. And we're going to make some adjustments. So let's just bring it in. So what I'll do, let's go to our orthographic views, F5. And we'll have a look, first of all, at this view. And what we want is, we want this to be just smaller than the bounds of our box. And then what we can also do is bring that up like so. Something like that. And let's hit F5 to go back to our orthographic view. And then we will look at our top-down view. Let's just dolly out a bit. And then we'll bring this one in. So it's just within that bound. Something like that. All right. I think we could perhaps just go in a little bit further there. All right, let's hit F1. And now what we're going to say in our kill is we want to kill particles outside of the bounds. Now, we only want this kill modifier to affect our foam particles, not our fluid ones. So let's go to our water emitter. Let's go to our modifiers, and let's drag in the new kill. In fact, let's rename this. Let's call this kill foam. So we know, okay? Perfect. Excellent. And whilst we are there, there's one more thing that we need to do that we haven't done yet. So you can see in our simulation, if we hit play, our foam particles are being advected by our fluid. They're being moved along by the fluid. However, they're also being affected by modifiers in the scene, including the gravity, but including the xpWave modifier. And we don't want the foam particles being affected by this modifier. We just want the water to move them along. So let's go to our xpFoam emitter. Let's go to the modifiers and let's drag in the xpWave. And then this minus means it's excluded. It's not going to use that xpWave to move those foam particles because we just want the water to do that. Great. So we'll make that kill invisible. All right, let's hit play. So now we have stopped those foam particles being born on the edges and therefore getting kind of trapped on those edges. They're not now being moved by the wave. They're just being advected by the water. And it's looking pretty cool. We're still not getting that many on these rolling waves, though, are we? So let's go back to our xpFoam. And what we could do, look, we're getting some created there, which is looking pretty nice. So let's reduce this even more. Let's put this min down to, say, 2. Max down to, say, 5. Now, these are really low values for this. But again, this is because we don't have the fluid data to create realistic calculations here. But now, look, we're getting some nice cresting. Let's just let this simulation run through. That's looking pretty good. And we're getting some nice ones created here. Very cool. So what we could do at this point, now I've got more particles, let's change them from these squares down to, back to dots. Just force that display. So now we've got our foam particles here. What we could do, let's go to our xpFoam. Let's increase that minimum speed a little bit more. In fact, no, we'll leave that. We'll leave that as is. Let's bring down our min crest to 1, max crest to 2. So we're increasing the likelihood of it creating these crest particles. So they've got full potential of creating them by the time we get to 2% of that crest angle. Basically means it's more likely to to create those cresting foam particles. And now we're getting some here, look. Let's let the sim run just for a bit. And some nice ones here, look. Some here being created on this crest. All right. And let's go to the lowest we can go, 0 and 1, making it even more likely. So again, if this was in a very high resolution scene, these settings would be unrealistic and we'd have foam particles just covering every wave, which would look silly. But in this low resolution, fast simulating scene, it's actually we need the potential kind of ramped up that quickly to get particles being created when we've got our waves coming through. All right, got some nice ones created there, look. Some created on this edge of this crest here. So the reason why we're not getting any here, this must be moving too slowly to be considered. So what we could try is, look, let's reduce down our min speed. Let's put our max speed down as well. And let's see if that makes a difference in creating some more on these rolling waves. Getting some there now, look. That's made quite a few more. So now we're getting them starting to be created, look. Now we've decided where those foam particles are going to be created on the crests of these waves. Now, if you need more particles, what we could do is increase the crest rate. So that won't change the distribution where they're created from. It'll just create more on those angles and speeds. So if we put that up, now we're going to get loads more. There we go. So there's all our... So now we've created loads of these foamy particles as our simulation goes on. So let's just leave that running for a bit. But even when we've got them coloured in this unrealistic green colour, you can see it brings so much more detail to the scene. While we leave that running, let's go to our emitter foam. Let's go to our display and change that from green down to the actual white. So the new ones now are going to be born a white colour, which will look a little better for us. And here are crest particles being formed. All right. So you can see that that's working very nicely indeed. So let's go to our xpFoam settings. So that's what we have for our crest particles. We have to adjust the minimum and maximum speed threshold to make sure that we're getting particles created at the appropriate speed. And then we adjust our minimum and maximum crest threshold, which dictates where on the crest of the wave, at what angle that crest is at, to create those particles. Now, because we're in a very, as I said, a very low resolution, low accuracy fluid sim here, we don't have very realistic values here. These are way too low. But for this scene, bringing them down actually gets us something that works. And this looks pretty nice. And look, this is running in our viewport. This isn't cached, and we're getting pretty decent playback for this amount of particles. Okay, so let's switch off our crest particles now. Just turn that to 0. We'll leave all the settings as they were. And now let's have a look at our air rate particles. So the crest is looking at, obviously, the angle at which the crest is at on the wave. The air particles is air that is trapped between fluid particles. So, for example, when a crest splashes into the water, it brings air with it, it traps particles, and it creates foam and spray. So if we hit play now, because we've zeroed out both the crest and the air rate, we're not going to get any foam particles at all. So let's put our air rate up to what is the default of 40. So now the air rate, the particles need to be moving above, within the potential of this min-max speed, but they also then need to kind of comply with this minimum and maximum impact threshold, which works in exactly the same way as the crest and the speed. But what you'll find is you're going to need much lower values than the default 30 and 70. So in this low resolution simulation, we're going to have to put this min just down to 0, and we're going to put the max impact on the minimum right down to 1, which means that we're ramping up to full potential of creating these air particles as soon as we get up to 1 impact. It's going to make it much more likely to have those. So if we hit play now, let's just have a look at our simulation. And after frame 35, we're starting to create these particles. And look, as those water particles are moving faster or slower relative to each other, they're trapping air and they're creating these really nice looking particles. So now we have these in the scene. We probably don't need as much of the crest as we had. Remember, we upped that from the default 20 to 40. So let's put this on 20, which is the default. Let's run that sim. So now we have both crest and air rate particles being created. Let's just dolly out a bit. And now we're getting loads more in this scene. Now what you'll find is with low accuracy fluid sims, you'll get a lot of these air rate particles, especially in shallower areas of the sim. And we can see that happening here. And the reason that is happening is because the velocity calculation in the fluid solve isn't accurate. And if we just switch off foam, you can see that the velocity calculation isn't accurate in this sim because look at all of this colour flashing on the bottom level on the bed and here. That's indicating that the velocity of those particles is changing quite markedly from frame to frame. That's because the velocity solve isn't very accurate, because we've got xpFluid effects set to fast accuracy. To have a more accurate velocity calculation, it needs more substeps. So if we had a more accurate velocity calculation, you wouldn't have as much kind of frenetic movement here in the shallow areas. And as a result, you wouldn't have as many impact air particles being created, because these fluid particles wouldn't be moving faster than each other relative to each other. So that's the reason in a low fluid accuracy sim, you'll get lots of these trapped air particles, because these particles are moving very quickly relative to each other just because of an inaccurate velocity solve. However, fortunately, it still looks quite good. So you can get away with this in these low accuracy sims, and we're getting a low look. We've got a great amount of these particles now, and it just brings so much more life and detail to the sim, and it starts to look like an ocean lapping, as you would expect. So that's looking really cool. So just finally, we have some, if we go back to our xpFoam, so we've looked at our emission settings. This is the creation of our particles. We have a surface option. So by default, this is set to 50%. And for most use cases, you'll just leave this at 50%. And this is just a way of ensuring that our foam particles don't float too high above the surface of our fluid. And if the surface is set to 100%, you can get that undesirable effect. And it's just to do with the way in which the fluid is calculated and the way in which the foam is calculated based on the radius of particles. We don't need to know the exact workings of that, but we have the surface set to 50%, which ensures that we can bring down the surface level of those foam particles to better match the fluid surface level of the underlying water particles. So for most cases, just leave that on 50%. Then we have this radius value as well, and this is based on the radius of our fluid particle, and it's how the foam particles are born, are spawned in relation to its parent fluid particle. And again, by default, this is set to 10%, and for most uses, you can just leave that on the default. So that's our emission settings. Then we have some advection settings. This is the movement of those foam particles once they have been created. And again, most use cases, you can just leave all of these settings on their defaults. You're able to adjust the buoyancy, and this affects how buoyant the particles are once they are underwater. So if they are under the water, how quickly they will rise to the surface. That is your buoyancy setting. And also you've got a drag setting, and this is how strongly those foam particles are dragged around by the fluid simulation. So they can be dragged around more strongly with a higher drag value or less strongly with a lower drag value. But the default of 70% is nice. And then we have some further settings, which, especially in a low resolution sim like this, are going to be difficult to see. But the spray amount is the amount of random velocity the foam particles are given on birth, which will kind of move them away slightly from their parent fluid particle. And then we have a foam density and a spray density setting. And this just dictates which particles are considered to be foam particles, which are kind of fully advected by the fluid, and which ones are spray particles, which are able to leave that fluid surface, and when they're on the surface, they're not advected quite as strongly as the foam ones. But in this sim, we're not going to see much differences by adjusting these, because we don't have that fluid accuracy and particle count. And again, most use cases, you can leave most of these advection settings just on their defaults and get nice effects. So there we have our sim. What we're going to do is we're just going to leave this running through, because remember, we got to a part of our xpWave where we had quite an angry wave at around the 600 frame mark. So what we'll do is we'll just leave this going through to that 600 frame amount, and we'll just see if we're getting a nice enough sim. And if we're pleased with that, what we'll do is we'll have a go at setting up a much higher resolution, high accuracy sim, and we'll cache that one out, and then we'll have a look at how we have a little bit more control of the foam and how our minimum and maximum thresholds give us a little bit more artistic control when we're using a much higher resolution and high accuracy fluid sim. So we're running through here. This is still looking nice. We're getting this nice foam lapping up and then kind of moving back as the waves move back into the full body of water. And it's looking really nice, really cool, getting some nice crest particles here. And some of them left behind, which then get lapped up by the next incoming wave. That's all looking very cool indeed. So here we are. We're coming up to the area where we had the most aggressive wave in this simulation. So let's say it may be too much. If it's too aggressive, we might need some changes. Here we go. It's coming up now. And there's a nice big wave. And that's probably a bit too big. That's like suddenly a tsunami, isn't it? Let's have a look. That's looking pretty cool. Actually, we can leave that. That's not too bad. We can maybe have had that dying out a little bit. It's moving a little bit unrealistically. But that's looking all right, actually. We'll just leave it for now. So what we could do, if we didn't want that to be so pronounced, we could go back to our xpWave, and we could either, we could reduce that fall off a little bit, the fall off strength, so it wasn't as strong, or we could perhaps, if we just go to our wave, let's make it visible. Let's go to the display and bring in the plane, which shows us the noise. This is the area of noise which has created the huge wave, and it's just a little bit too strong. So what we could do is actually bring in a bit of high clip. You see how that's bringing down some of that, some of the strength of that. So that would just dampen that down a little. So let's just leave that high clip down a bit like that. We can turn that wave off. And then it's just going to take away some of the power of that very strong bit. But the foam is looking really good. Excellent. So we'll leave that simulation there for now, and that's working on our very nice low resolution scene. So now what we'll do is we will move on and create a much higher resolution version. In this scene, we have our beach geometry. So this is exactly the same geometry as our previous sim, but what we're going to do here is demonstrate a much higher resolution and higher accuracy simulation. So if we just go forward one frame, this is a cached simulation. You can see that actually we have confined this simulation to a much narrower strip of that beach, and that is just to keep it more manageable. So in this scene, we have just under 75,000 fluid particles. Now, in the previous lower resolution scene, we had 20,000 fluid particles, but that covered virtually the entire ocean geometry. So this obviously is using far more particles to create the fluid simulation. Let's just switch off the foam particles for now. And we also went to our xpFluid effect settings, and we have set the accuracy to high. So this is a much more accurate simulation. The velocity solve is going to be much more stable and accurate, which means the fluid sim is more stable and accurate. And there we can see we've got much more detail now in this animating water. That means that the foam simulation that we have done, which is obviously based upon the data that the fluid simulation creates, is going to be more accurate. So let's activate our foam emitter. Again, this is cached. And if we hit play, you can see that our foam simulation has actually become much more precise. And if we go to our xpFoam object and have a look at the settings, you can see that we have our min and max crest threshold not set to incredibly low amounts like we did before, and that's because we have the fluid data for this to be able to process much more kind of realistic, accurate min and max crest angle settings. And if we scrub through, you can really see now, look, that we're getting those crest particles nicely being created at the appropriate part on those crests. And because we have got our min set to 20 and our max at 30, there's kind of effectively a fade in of these crest particles. So we don't just have stripes of particles being created when the crests reach the appropriate angle, but we're getting a nice kind of fade in. So it's basically looking nice and organic and realistic. As those waves roll in, if we scrub through, look, we're getting those nice crest particles. And then when they crash into the water, we obviously create the impact particles. And then if we look in this area down here, we've just got really nice kind of advection going on as those foam particles are being moved by the lapping waves that come up. So you can see a much more detailed and much more precise foam simulation based on this more detailed and precise fluid simulation. And the higher the accuracy of the fluid, the more artist adjustability you will see in adjusting these various different thresholds. Another couple of things to point out for this simulation, which is something that you can do, is if we have a look in our modifiers list, you can see that we actually have two gravity objects in here now. We have a foam gravity and we have the regular gravity. And what we have done is we have gone to our regular gravity and left it on the default. Now this gravity is just affecting our fluid particles. So if we go to our foam emitter and go to the modifiers tab, you can see, look, we are saying don't be affected by this gravity. So it's not affecting the foam particles. And then if we go to our new gravity, which we've called gravity foam, you can see we've given it less gravitational strength. And so we've gone to the water emitter and said, don't be affected by the foam gravity. So we've got basically a gravity modifier for each particle, for the foam particles and for the water. And the reason we've given a gravity with lower strength for the foam is that we just get a little bit more of a kind of organic separation. When those foam particles are created, we get them kind of almost kicking up a little bit more and then falling towards the surface of the water a little bit more slowly. And it just breaks them up a little and gives them a bit more of a feeling of kind of spraying outwards and dropping. And then obviously when they reach the fluid surface, they're then affected by the fluid anyway. But we get a very nice kind of organic fall of those foam particles by giving them a slightly lower gravitational strength. And one more thing to point out in this simulation, because we had two gravity objects now in our scene, we just need to do one more thing. In our xpFoam solver, you can see in the advection settings we have the ability to drag in a gravity object. Now this gravity here is what drives the effect of our buoyancy setting. So a gravity object with more gravitational force will mean that particles will float up more quickly due to the way in which buoyancy works. So we just need to make sure that we're using the right gravity to calculate the buoyancy, and we want the regular gravity, the one that's at its default settings, to be driving those buoyancy values, which is why we've dragged in our first XP gravity into the advection gravity window to make sure we've got the correct kind of buoyancy calculation for the scene. So that's looking really cool. And another thing to note, you can see that our water looks much smoother. Fluid Effects gives you a much more kind of smooth simulation the higher you go in the accuracy settings. And one thing you can do to ensure that it doesn't look too smooth and therefore kind of almost looks a bit scaled down is that we can go into the water, extended data, fluid data settings, and we've just reduced the viscosity of this fluid down a little. The default is 30. We've reduced it down to 10. And similarly, we've also reduced the surface tension of this water body down from the default 3 to 1. And it just means that it's going to give it the ability to act a little bit more frenetically, even though we're on accuracy high. And it means that it's going to not give that kind of scaled down feeling that viscosity and surface tension can give. And the result is this really nice, smooth fluid simulation using our xpWave to generate this kind of pulsing waves crashing into our shore, and then xpFoam creating our impact and our crest particles to bring a very nice amount of detail and interest to this simulation.